Last night again I managed to sleep with one trazodone and half a Seroquel, so that is good news. I feel that hot spring the other day really helped to mineralize me and calm me down a little bit, I guess. And today I got a few cool nature videos. One of them is the coolest ever, and it's slow motion of a ladybug taking off. Wait, I need to balance. And another one I took was with hummingbirds, and they're just so cute. I could watch them all day long. Birdie! Hi, Birdie! And I got another close-up video with a ladybug that was really cool.
Hovering over him.
Adventures in the ladybug. Whoa. I'm not getting him. Ooh.
You just pooped on me.
Why? I can't see what I'm doing. I don't know if I'm getting it. Nature is just really fascinating and cool. And I started to look through some of my old notes when I first went into map consciousness 6 years ago, and it's interesting how many of the themes are the same. Not all the information, but wanting to help people. Also, there's a lot of stuff about trying to figure out how to navigate that territory. And a lot of it is really out there, like when the lights are on, that means I'm in the other world, or just really weird associations, but it showed that I was really confused about how to operate in that realm. So I took a few pictures, and I'll put some of them in here. one of the things I wrote is, when you find the purpose of your pain, you will go through it. And I still feel like I need to go through my pain, the pain that this lithium is suppressing, and it's not going to hold it at bay forever. And the purpose is to go through it, and when I do get to the point of going through it instead of just suppressing it, I definitely want to document that process. It's probably going to be super ugly, and that's okay. And part of the thing about going through that is that ugliness, in a way, helps with compassion, because if one is in such pain and it's an awful state of being, when one gets through it, one can have more compassion for other people's pain, because we all have pain. And I've talked about how it seems like some of it is extra, possibly from being sensitive to things. And I even wrote something about that sensitivity. I wrote one about being more sensitive. To sound and to everything. And I think being sensitive to sound on the outside, one is also sensitive to sound on the inside, which could even be other people's sounds on the inside. And there's even stuff I wrote about the ripple effect of action, or inspire people to help the planet just by moving their bodies, which is all implying epigenetics in a way. And with all the things I wrote about, when I do this, this happens, and it seems like these things are associated. It's almost seeing that the inner is the outer, and there's no real difference, that the inner affects the outer, and the inner is the outer. So knowing that one can create the outer, as it's all one process. So I was sensing that and feeling like it was hard to take a step without noticing some effect and then trying to adjust to it. So it was quite challenging, and eventually I took enough steps that I ended up in the psych ward. And then they restore the sense of being separate again. So I'll keep reading through some of that information. I wrote a lot of pages all those years ago. At home I have notebooks aside from that I've written since, that I haven't really looked at, but might be worth a read when I get home. I know one of them has a lot of the whole biochemical stuff, things to do with nutrition that could be helpful, that I'm definitely not following right now. I'm just kind of eating cake and ice cream. And I still have a little bit more stuff to talk about related to the Neuroscience Summit and what Dr. Daniel Siegel was saying. And again, when I say stuff that other people say, I'm not being critical of it. I'm actually just adding something that I see from what they're saying related to my extrapolation process. So using what they say as a prompt, but sometimes what I say related to what they say has nothing really to do with what they say, but it's helpful in adding to the context I'm creating. So for example, Dr. Daniel Siegel says that mind is an emergent property of the brain, meaning an emergent property is something greater than the sum of its parts. So it's hard to explain the mind from just the materials in the brain. And I was thinking about this related to how as people who go into map consciousness, I feel like we're each cells in a greater something. So if we put all our brains together, 100 people in map consciousness, there might be something emergent from those people coming together contextually and however it works. So there might be some kind of emergent intelligence from connecting people of this neurotribe, because we don't know what the emergent properties of a cohesive, coherent humanity are. And I think the emergent properties of that are how beautifully we experience life in the height of mania, but one can't stay there when one is there by oneself, because it's sort of this emergent thing that one can have a taste of, but is difficult to stay in because the conditions aren't right. That would be like asking one water molecule to be a cloud. So 100 people who are so-called bipolar might form some other cohesion, and this emergent property that we can somewhat experience in our brain of mania, beauty, love, oneness, eternity, ecstasy, joy, could be our natural state when we're all playing off each other that way together. But it's so difficult to stay there when it's a relational state. It's not like I'm super joyful and I can just be that way forever by myself. Society destroys that. Society destroys that emergent property. And there's also the emergent property of altruism and selflessness. And I think oneness is an emergent property of humanity as a whole. Oneness has no meaning if we're not together as a whole. It's only a concept, but there probably is this emergent property of actual oneness, this felt sense, this mirror neuron thing. An emergent property of the brain could actually be a quantum brain. And when more people are in concert as quantum brains, then it's more possible for the brains to stay in the state of possibility. And I was thinking about thoughts as suggestions and how they're hypnotizing. Each thought we hear inside our own head is hypnotizing us. And words in our head are a type of sleepiness. So we're definitely in a hypnagogic trance when we're thinking. So with this whole emergent property of emerging together, merging together, can we take a journey back to Manic Land and pull everyone there with us? And our brains can exist in the lightscape of insight and intelligence instead of the soundscape of thought. And Dr. Daniel Siegel talked about the 4 facets that may be emergent properties of energy and information flow. One is subjective experience, one is information processing, one is consciousness, and another is self-organization. And for sure in map consciousness, information processing goes through the roof. One's subjective experience changes incredibly in quality. One's level of consciousness changes, and there's some kind of self-organization happening of a different kind. And he talks about how complex systems have properties of being chaotic, open systems and non-linear systems. And then he goes on to say that we as humans are complex systems. And he also said that this means just a small input can lead to large, unpredictable results. Does it not make sense that the universe can input even a small amount of some other quality of energy that is causing these large changes in people and their unpredictable results. And thought and thinking is all about predicting one's results and staying consistent. And he kept using the phrase, and this is really weird. And I feel like, well, map consciousness is really weird. And it's one thing to do science and discover weirdness about the brain. It's another thing to live through something like map consciousness. And then he said something really weird. He said, the mind has a mind of its own. And then I think to myself, if he as this awesome neuroscience guy is saying the mind has a mind of its own, yet people who connect with that in an embodied way, experiencing that there's this mind that has a mind of its own that can animate us in ways according to this mind with a mind of its own, yet as soon as that actually happens, beyond the statement, the abstraction of the mind has a mind of its own, then the person is called mentally ill, and all of a sudden they can't integrate, they can't this and that and the next thing. So I just don't understand that. It seems our human brain wants to just abstract about these weirdnesses, but as soon as somebody goes into it, we want to write them off and drug them. So it's my job to awaken the intelligence of Maniacs, of the trans-conscious altruist neurotribe. We don't need their help, they need ours. And if you've been to map consciousness land, you know what I'm talking about. So this mind that has a mind of its own has taken me over several times. I want this mind that has a mind of its own to become my mind, so I don't need to keep blocking it with these meds and fear that energy arising in me. I'm going to set up an experiment about this. And Dr. Daniel Siegel also talked about optimized integration by linking differentiated parts. And I feel as a member of this neurotribe that I am just a piece of the puzzle. I am just one differentiated part, and there's hundreds or thousands of other people out there who are other differentiated parts, and we need to link up and integrate through dialogue, through creativity, through this other way of living that we've connected with. And when we do that and our brains are working together, it will be very powerful. Forget this whole one little lone, separate, integrated, regular consciousness brain. And then when our brain disintegrates from that, because it's meant to link up with other brains that are similar, that limited brain calls us deficient. And there's an intelligence that's trying to integrate us. And he talked about strengthening the mind through regulation. And right now I'm regulating my brain with medication, but perhaps ECPR and linking up with other people of this type of consciousness, of this neurotribe, will help with the regulation. And then he said the mind can change the molecules of the body, and you bet your butt it can. And that's what that mind that has a mind of its own comes in and does. It changes so much of the neurophysiology and neurochemistry of the body and puts us in this state of oneness. It probably creates dimethyltryptamine. Who knows what it all creates. Maybe it's trying to create a bunch of superhumans. We often feel like superheroes in that state. So gather your gifts and gather your powers and meet me at the top of the mountain. And he said, where attention goes, neurofiring flows and neurons grow. So most of our attention goes on this me, which is an illusion. So most of our brains and brain cells are devoted to this illusion called me. Now if we look at beauty, it grows beauty brain cells. We need more nature neurons, because when we have those brain cells and they grow, Our brains resonate with those nature brain cells, and that resonance from our brain speaks to nature, and we can pick up more on nature. And nature knows that we're here and that we're not going to let nature be destroyed. And nature is less likely to destroy us in return. That might be all we need to do to save the earth from destroying us, is just look at nature more. And he said create states and states become traits. So that goes along with embodying one's mania, practicing one's manic traits. Why would we practice the traits that society tells us to practice? Why wouldn't we practice the traits that the universe has shown us how to practice? And then he said, what you do with your mind changes the molecules of your body and changes the functions of your body, like your enzymes, etc. He said, what you do with your mind. I say, what about what the mind does with us? Which is that energy, which is mania, that animates us. What does that energy do? What molecules does that change? What functionality does that change? It changes our gestures, it changes our actions, and that's changing our DNA, that's changing our physiology. And what he's talking about is on the level of what we as limited ego selves can do to change our mind. There's a greater mind that can change our mind and our brain and our body. We need to worry less about our own integration and worry more about the disintegration of nature. Nature is becoming less differentiated and we are less linked to it. Because he said the best predictor of health is how well the differentiated parts are linked. Well, we just think of that in terms of human constructs, but what about the larger Gaia sphere? And this really isn't about mental health. It's not about anything. It's as a human being. I was talking to somebody who told me about the term, the clinical gaze, and I'd never heard this term, but to me it resonates with what I've talked about as the light coming out of one's eyes and how that warps a vulnerable person along the trajectory of how they're being judged. And this term clinical gaze is something that goes along with that. And I feel like bipolar is increased action potential, meaning that all the gestures and behaviors of being a human being become available from the highest to the lowest, and one sort of goes through all those in order to really have a recalibration of the brain for proper mirror neurons to know how to respond adequately in a moment when one sees something mirrored of that, and it also shows why not to participate in certain things. So we have access from the highest gesture to the lowest. And since we've been released from map consciousness, can we gesture in that energy in ourselves to also concurrently bring it about in reality? Instead of having concurrent disorders, can we have concurrent order? Our gestures and our words and our actions and our feelings and our thoughts to gesture in the manic world. And it seems the mind wants more people in touch with the mind so it can use the brain to create itself. There's only one mind, there's no separate minds. And can we act based on what we feel the world needs us to create as people who have gone into map consciousness and set foot in that other world and have somewhat of a fuzzy map of it? And it's not a place, it's actually somewhere within ourselves. And we're like flowers as we connect with that and let it grow. The whole world flowers as that. This is just a dialogue in consciousness. I'm just speaking as that which I connected with 6 years ago. And not writing it off as a meaningless mental illness. And when we think that we have meaningless mental illness, we accept those thought structures in our brain, and those encase our brain cells and make us afraid and fear making meaning again. And seeing meaning and wondering what that was all about. It takes tiny gestures of connection. Just reach out. Reach out as the mind